the most connected generation, and the loneliest. When was the last time you felt truly seen? Not noticed, not greeted, not liked or followed or replied to. Seen, the way you feel when another person looks at you, and you know, without any doubt, that they understand something real about who you are. If you have to think about it, you're already where this story begins. You are holding, or sitting near, the most powerful connection device ever invented. You have access to more people, more conversations, more communities than any human being in history. Your phone has not been 3 feet away from you all day. You have hundreds of contacts, and the platforms that host them are optimized at a level of engineering sophistication that would astonish any previous generation to keep you connected around the clock. And the United States Surgeon General, in a formal advisory issued in May 2023, declared that about half of American adults report measurable loneliness, not occasional loneliness, measurable loneliness, before COVID even began. Vivek Murthy, the nation's top physician, wrote, "We exist in the most technologically connected age in the history of civilization, yet rates of loneliness have doubled since the 1980s. He called it a public health crisis. The most connected generation in history is also, by the data, among the loneliest. There is a man named Robert Waldinger. He is a Harvard psychiatrist who has directed the longest happiness study ever conducted. 87 years of data on what actually makes for a good life. He has seen the numbers. He has read every correlation, every regression, every longitudinal curve. He is also an ordained Zen priest. He has seen the data and kept the practice. That combination is where tonight's video lives." Chapter 1. The Paradox. Let's start with what we actually know. The Surgeon General's advisory on loneliness runs to 82 pages. It draws on decades of research across dozens of countries, involving millions of people. And its central finding is not complicated. Human beings need connection the way they need food and sleep. When that need goes unmet, not occasionally, but chronically, the consequences are not merely emotional. They are physical, they are measurable. And for the demographic in this room tonight, they are urgent. In 2015, a researcher named Julianne Holt-Lunstad published what remains the most comprehensive analysis of social connection and mortality ever conducted. She and her colleagues examined data from 148 studies, involving over 300,000 participants across multiple countries and decades. Their finding: people with adequate social connection have a 26% lower risk of premature death. Social isolation increases that risk by 29%. Living alone adds 32%. And then came the comparison that made headlines around the world. The mortality risk from loneliness is comparable, Holt-Lunstad found, to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Not metaphorically comparable, statistically comparable. The Surgeon General cited that research when he issued his advisory. He was not speaking loosely. He was doing what physicians do when a condition reaches crisis level, naming it, quantifying it, and calling for a response. The response, however, is not straightforward. Because if the problem was simply that people lacked access to other people, the solution would be obvious. Build community centers, run social programs, get people into the same room. But we already live in the most densely connected moment in human history, and it is not working. Let's narrow this down to where it lands most directly, because this is not a generic crisis. It has a shape, and that shape fits a specific kind of person with particular precision. You are likely male. You are likely over 55. And if you are American, The statistics that follow are not abstractions. Robin Dunbar is an evolutionary anthropologist at Oxford who has spent decades studying how human beings form and maintain social bonds. His finding, which has been replicated across cultures, is that men's friendships are structurally different from women's. Women's friendships are built on conversation. They survive distance, they survive infrequency, they survive long silences, because the friendship itself is the point. Men's friendships, by contrast, are built on shared activity. You are friends because you play golf together, because you work together, because your children are the same age and you coach the same team. When the activity ends, the friendship often ends with it. Retirement is the clearest example. You leave a career that provided not only income and purpose, but a ready-made social structure, colleagues, routines, a place where you were known and needed, and you discover that the relationships you thought you had were, in many cases, relationships of circumstance. They do not transfer. The calendar empties. The phone rings less, and you find yourself with more time than you have ever had and fewer people to spend it with. Billy Baker, a journalist who spent years investigating this phenomenon for the Boston Globe, arrived at a conclusion that stopped many of his readers cold. He wrote that the biggest threat facing middle-aged men is not smoking, not obesity, not any of the conditions we associate with declining health. It is loneliness. The AARP has been tracking chronic loneliness in adults over 45 since 2010. In that year, 35% of adults in that age range reported chronic loneliness. By 2023, that number had risen to 40%. 1 in 3, then 2 in 5, in less than 15 years. And here is what makes those numbers particularly serious for this demographic. Loneliness does not carry the same consequences at every age. For adults over 65, chronic loneliness is associated with approximately a 50% increase in the risk of dementia, a 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, and a 32% increase in the risk of stroke. The condition that many people dismiss as sadness, as something to manage privately, as a weakness rather than a health event, is quietly shaping the last chapter of many lives. So we are connected, and we are lonely. And the natural assumption is that the solution is to connect more, but that assumption does not survive contact with the evidence. Sherry Turkle is a professor at MIT who has spent 4 decades studying how technology changes the way human beings relate to one another. Her conclusion, reached after thousands of interviews, is not that technology is useless for connection. It is something more precise and more uncomfortable. We have begun to substitute connection for conversation. We have the appearance of being together, the notifications, the replies, the presence in each other's feeds, while increasingly sacrificing the thing that connection is supposed to deliver. She wrote, "We sacrifice conversation for mere connection. We are," she observed, "together but alone." And here is the mechanism underneath that observation. Loneliness is not a deficiency of contact. It is a deficiency of quality. It is the gap between the connection you have and the connection you need. The gap between being around people and being known by them. Robert Waldinger's research makes this concrete. The Harvard study of adult development has followed 2 groups of men since 1938. One group of Harvard undergraduates, one group of inner-city Boston youth, tracking them across their entire lives, into old age, into death, and now into the next generation. It is the longest study of human flourishing ever conducted, and after 87 years of data, the single strongest predictor of health and happiness in later life is not wealth. It is not fame. It is not achievement. It is the quality of a person's relationships at age 50, not the quantity, the quality, which means that telling a lonely person to connect more is roughly equivalent to telling a malnourished person to eat more, without addressing what they're eating or how they're eating it. The volume is not the variable, something else is. The question is, what? Cacioppo saw it from one direction, the Buddha saw it from another, and when you lay the two accounts side by side, something striking happens. They are not the same map, but they are mapping the same territory. Chapter 2. The Vicious Cycle. John Cacioppo spent most of his career at the University of Chicago trying to understand what loneliness actually is, not as a feeling, but as a biological event. His starting point was evolutionary. Loneliness, he argued, is not a malfunction. It is a signal, the same category of signal as hunger or physical pain. When your body needs food, it produces discomfort that motivates you to seek it. When you are injured, pain focuses your attention on the wound. When your social bonds are threatened or absent, loneliness arises to motivate reconnection. In the ancestral environment, isolation was genuinely dangerous. A human being alone on the savannah was a human being vulnerable to predators, to starvation, to injury with no one to help. The pain of loneliness was the nervous system's way of saying, "Find your people." This matters for survival. The signal is not the problem. The signal is functional. The problem begins when the signal becomes chronic. When it fires and the reconnection it calls for does not come, or does not satisfy, or is attempted in ways that make the underlying condition worse, because loneliness, Cacioppo found, does something to the brain over time. It does not simply persist as an unpleasant feeling. It rewires the cognitive architecture through which a lonely person reads the social world. The cycle works like this. Isolation produces a low-level, largely unconscious state of hypervigilance towards social threat. The lonely brain begins to scan its environment differently, not for opportunity, but for danger. It becomes more sensitive to signals of rejection, exclusion, and criticism. It begins to interpret ambiguous social information in the most threatening direction available. The neutral expression on a colleague's face reads as coldness. The unreturned message reads as dismissal. The conversation that ends a little abruptly reads as confirmation of what the lonely person already fears, that they are fundamentally unwanted. This cognitive bias then produces behavioral changes. The lonely person becomes more self-protective, more withdrawn, more guarded, less likely to initiate, less able to sustain the kind of open, vulnerable engagement that genuine connection requires. And here is the cruelty of the mechanism. Other people perceive that withdrawal as coldness. They respond by pulling back, which deepens the isolation, which intensifies the hypervigilance, which produces more withdrawal. The cycle feeds itself. Cacioppo and his colleagues also found something that should alarm anyone who thinks of loneliness as a private condition. In a landmark study conducted with James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis in 2009, they demonstrated that loneliness is socially contagious. A direct friend of a lonely person is 52% more likely to become lonely themselves. A friend of that friend, 2 degrees of separation, is 25% more likely. At 3 degrees, the effect is still detectable at 15%. Loneliness spreads through social networks the way a mood spreads through a room, not by anyone choosing to transmit it, but through the subtle behavioral signals that alter the quality of every interaction the lonely person has, and the physical consequences compound over time. Chronic loneliness is associated with elevated cortisol, increased vascular resistance, fragmented sleep, and what researchers call a conserved transcriptional response to adversity. Changes in gene expression that upregulate inflammatory processes and down-regulate antiviral responses. The lonely body is a body under threat. It behaves accordingly. And those physiological states, sustained over years, are among the mechanisms through which loneliness produces the mortality risks Holt-Lunstad documented. Cacioppo's clinical conclusion was precise. The most effective interventions for chronic loneliness are not social skills training, and they are not simply increasing social exposure. They are cognitive. They target the way lonely people interpret social information, the hypervigilance, the negative bias, the threat detection architecture that turns every ambiguous signal into evidence of rejection. The cycle, in other words, is not primarily social. It is cognitive. It runs inside the mind before it runs between people. 2,500 years before Cacioppo published his first paper on loneliness, a man sitting in northern India developed a detailed map of how human suffering perpetuates itself. The map is called dependent origination, paticca samuppada, and it describes 12 linked conditions, each arising in dependence on the one before it, each sustaining the next, the whole chain turning on itself in a cycle that the Buddha compared to a wheel. SN 12.2. The Buddha was not mapping loneliness specifically. He was mapping the structure of dukkha, of suffering in its broadest sense. But when you lay Cacioppo's cycle alongside the 12 nidanas, something becomes visible that neither account makes fully explicit on its own. Two careful observers of the same human predicament, one in ancient India, one in a modern neuroscience laboratory, mapped the same cycle. The Buddha did not predict Cacioppo. What careful observation of suffering tends to reveal, across very different frameworks and centuries of separation, is the same shape. Here is how the map applies. Avidya, ignorance, or wrong seeing, is the root condition. Applied to loneliness, it is the fundamental misperception that another person can fill the ache, that if the right relationship arrives, or the right group accepts you, or the right recognition comes, the underlying sense of lack will resolve. This is the premise the lonely person operates from. It is not examined. It is assumed. From that wrong seeing, sankhara, habitual formations, the grooves of conditioned response, arise. The scroll through the phone at 2 a.m, the compulsive checking for replies, the way certain patterns of seeking become automatic, running on their own momentum, long after the seeker has forgotten why they started. These patterns produce vijnana and namarupa, consciousness and the psychophysical complex, engaging with the world through the 6 sense bases, making contact, phassa, generating vedana, the feeling tone that colors every experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. For the chronically lonely person, the baseline vedana of their social world has tipped toward the unpleasant. This is exactly where Cacioppo's hypervigilance lives, in the feeling tone through which the lonely person registers every social signal before they have consciously interpreted it. And here the critical link fires. Tanha arises, craving. The unpleasant vedana of isolation, that low background ache, triggers craving for its opposite. This is not pathological in itself. The Buddha endorsed social connection. He said, in one of his most striking statements, that admirable friendship is not half the holy life, but the whole of it. The craving for genuine connection is appropriate. The problem is what happens next. Upadana, clinging, takes that craving and narrows it to specific objects, not connection in general. This person must answer. This group must include me. This level of recognition must arrive. And in particular, and here the Buddha's analysis goes somewhere Cacioppo does not, Attavada Upadana arises, the clinging to a doctrine of self. The lonely person does not simply want connection. They need the connection to confirm something, that they are someone, that they matter, that they exist in a way that registers for others. Every encounter becomes beneath its surface a referendum on the self. Bhava follows, becoming. The person becomes in their own experience and in how they move through the world. Someone defined by the lack. The loneliness is no longer something they feel. It is something they are. And as jati, birth into that identity, consolidates, Jaramarana completes the cycle. Suffering arises whenever connection changes, disappoints, is withheld, or is misperceived as rejection, which, given the hypervigilance Cacioppo described, happens constantly. The wheel turns. Now notice where Cacioppo's most effective intervention lands, at the cognitive interpretation of social signals, at the moment between stimulus and response, between Vedana and the reactive patterns that follow. Not at the level of social opportunity, at the level of how the mind reads what it encounters. The Buddha's map points to the same location. The chain can be interrupted, but it must be interrupted at Vedana, at the moment when the unpleasant feeling tone arises and craving moves to fill it. Seeing that movement clearly, without immediately acting on it, is where the possibility of a different response begins. Neither account says, need fewer people. Neither says, the ache is wrong. What both say, from their very different vantage points, is that the cycle is running inside the mind before it runs between people. And that is where it must be addressed. Chapter 3. Kalyana Mittata. There is a conversation in the Pali Canon that is easy to misread the first time you encounter it. The monk Ananda, the Buddha's closest companion, the one who attended him for the last 25 years of his life, approaches the Buddha one morning and shares an insight he has just had. He says, "This is half of the holy life, Lord. Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie. It sounds like a reasonable observation. Spiritual friendship matters. Community supports practice." Ananda is not wrong to notice this, but the Buddha's reply is immediate and unequivocal. Don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. SN 45.2. Not half, the whole. This is a startling claim from a tradition that is often understood, and often misunderstood, as a path of solitary inner cultivation. And the Buddha does not leave it as an assertion. He explains the mechanism. When a monk has admirable people as friends, companions, and comrades, he can be expected to develop and pursue the noble eightfold path. And then, going further, it is in dependence on me as an admirable friend that beings subject to birth have gained release from birth, that beings subject to aging have gained release from aging, that beings subject to death have gained release from death. The path to liberation, the Buddha says, runs through relationship. Not despite it, through it. The Pali term he uses is Kalyana Mittata. Admirable friendship, beautiful friendship, the friendship of those who are genuinely committed to each other's flourishing. Thanisaro Bhikkhu renders it as admirable friendship. Bhikkhu Bodhi renders it as good friendship. The etymology, Kalyana, beautiful or auspicious, Mitta, friend, carries something the translations struggle to fully convey. The sense that this is friendship that is itself a form of excellence, not merely companionship, not social proximity, a relationship whose quality is part of what the path consists of. The Buddha's reasoning illuminates exactly what Cacioppo's research found, though from a completely different direction. Cacioppo showed that the quality of social bonds, not their quantity, determines their effect on health and well-being. The Buddha is saying something structurally similar at the level of awakening. What matters is not whether you have people around you, but what those relationships are made of. Whether they support clarity, integrity, and genuine understanding, or whether they reinforce the patterns that perpetuate suffering. In the Digajanu Sutta, AN 8.54, the Buddha describes what we might call the contagion of admirable friendship, but in the direction of flourishing rather than suffering. He observes that a person with admirable friends naturally absorbs their qualities: sada, conviction grounded in experience; sila, ethical integrity; kaga, generosity; panya, discernment. We become, gradually and largely without noticing it, like the people we spend the most time with. The lonely person's vicious cycle is a version of this same mechanism running in reverse, absorbing the hypervigilance, the negative interpretive bias, the contracted orientation toward others that loneliness installs. Kalyana mittata is not the recommendation to find nicer people. It is the recognition that the relationships we inhabit are not background to the path. They are part of the path's substance. The Buddha did not treat this as an individual matter alone. He embedded it in the third of the three jewels, the sangha, the community of practitioners. And in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, D. 16, in what would prove to be among his final teachings, he articulated what makes a community healthy. 7 conditions of non-decline for any group of people who intend to live well together. 3 of them stand out with particular clarity. The first, meet regularly and meet in numbers. The commitment to showing up, not when it is convenient, not when the mood is right, but consistently, as a practice in itself. Regularity is not incidental to community. It is one of the conditions from which community is made. The second, conduct the business of the community in harmony, not in the absence of disagreement. Harmony does not mean uniformity, but with the intention that decisions emerge from a quality of mutual regard, rather than from domination, faction, or resentment. The way a group makes decisions is itself a form of teaching. The third, and perhaps the most counterintuitive, each person's individual contemplative practice is the ground of collective warmth, not the other way around. The community does not produce the interior practice. The interior practice, each person's own cultivation of attention, integrity, and honest self-knowledge, is what flows outward into the quality of the relationships. A community of people who are working on themselves, in the Buddhist sense, produces something different from a community of people who are simply in proximity. This is not a small distinction, and it applies well beyond formal Buddhist practice. To any group of people who take seriously the question of how to live, there is a phrase from the same sutta that is sometimes extracted and used to argue for something the Buddha almost certainly did not intend. He says to Ananda in the period after his death, "Be islands unto yourselves, be your own refuge. Take the Dhamma as your island, the Dhamma as your refuge. Do not take any other refuge." D. N. 16, section 2.33. This has sometimes been read as a Buddhist endorsement of solitude, of the lone practitioner needing no one, sufficient to themselves. But look at the context. The Buddha is speaking to Ananda, who is surrounded by the assembled sangha. He is speaking within community to community, and the phrase is paired immediately with Dhamma Island. What he is pointing to is an interior practice, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which enables full and genuine participation in community without collapsing into dependence on any single person or teacher, including the Buddha himself. After his death, practice continues. The community continues. The interior refuge is what makes continued participation possible, without the clinging that causes suffering when the conditions of community inevitably change. Be your own lamp is an instruction in rigor. Practice thoroughly enough that you can show up fully to your relationships, without needing any single one of them to hold you up. Sherry Turkle, who has spent her career watching what happens when human beings lose the capacity for genuine encounter, arrived at a formulation that lands differently now than it did when she first wrote it. Loneliness, she said, is failed solitude. Read that slowly. She is not saying loneliness and solitude are the same. She is saying they are made of the same raw material, aloneness. And what differentiates them is what the person brings to that aloneness. Solitude is aloneness met with enough interior resource that it becomes generative. Reflection, rest, renewal, clarity. Loneliness is aloneness met without those resources, met with clinging, with the ache of unfulfilled craving, with the compulsive need for the silence to end. The Thai Buddhist teacher Ayya Khmer said something that converges with this from the other direction. Solitude can only be fully experienced when there is inner peace. Otherwise, loneliness pushes one to try and remedy a feeling of emptiness. Same external condition, radically different inner relationship. The Buddhist path trains precisely this. The capacity for chosen solitude. Kaya viveka, physical seclusion. Chitta viveka, mental seclusion. Not as an end in itself, but as cultivation of the interior stability that makes genuine connection possible. When you can be alone without panic, when the silence does not immediately collapse into craving for noise or company, you bring something different into your relationships. You are no longer coming to them as someone who needs rescuing. Brené Brown, a researcher who has spent 2 decades studying vulnerability and human connection, found something in her data that maps onto this with striking precision. She wrote, "In order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen, and elsewhere. The one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection. The armor we wear to protect ourselves from rejection is the same armor that prevents us from being found. Self-protection and disconnection are not opposites. They are the same movement." The Buddha would agree with this diagnosis entirely. And then he would go one step further. Because what Brown describes as armor, the Buddha would recognize as attavada upadana, clinging to a doctrine of self, to the project of constructing and defending a particular identity. The lonely person does not simply fear rejection. They bring the entire weight of their self-construction into every encounter. The need to be seen a certain way, confirmed a certain way, valued in terms that align with how they understand themselves. The other person stops being a person. They become a mirror. And what the lonely person is really asking beneath every conversation is not, "How are you?" but, "Am I someone?" When that question is the subtext of every encounter, genuine meeting becomes nearly impossible. The other person feels it. The weight of being needed as confirmation rather than met as a human being. And they pull back, which the lonely person reads through their hypervigilance as exactly the rejection they feared. This is the cycle, seen now from the inside. What Kalyana Mittata asks is not that you find better people. It asks that you become a different kind of friend, one who can enter a relationship as an offer rather than a demand, one who has done enough interior work that the relationship is no longer required to perform the function of validating your existence. That is a practice. It does not happen by deciding to be less needy. It happens through cultivation, through the long, patient training of the heart that the Buddha called Brahmavihara, which is where we turn next. Chapter 4. The Practice. The word Brahma Vihara is usually translated as divine abiding or sublime dwelling. The Pali carries something worth holding on to. These are not states you visit. They are places you inhabit, orientations of mind so thoroughly cultivated that they become the ground from which you move through the world. There are 4 of them: metta, loving kindness, or more precisely, goodwill; karuna, compassion; mudita, sympathetic joy, the capacity to take genuine pleasure in another person's flourishing; and upekkha, equanimity, the stability that makes the other 3 possible without collapsing into sentimentality or exhaustion. What is critical to understand, before anything else, is what these states are not. They are not feelings you wait to have. They are not moods that arrive when conditions are favorable. They are not warmth you generate by thinking positive thoughts, or love you manufacture by trying harder to care. They are trained capacities. They are cultivated the way a musician cultivates technique, through repetition, through resistance, through the deliberate practice of something difficult until it becomes available. The fact that metta does not arise spontaneously when you sit down to practice is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. It is the starting condition of everyone who has ever practiced it seriously. Thanissaro Bhikkhu, whose translations and essays on the Pali Canon are among the most rigorous available in English, uses a phrase that clarifies this immediately. Metta as a skill, not a feeling. You are training the mind to hold a particular intention, the intention toward another's well-being, steadily, reliably, and especially in the moments when warmth is absent, particularly in those moments, because those are precisely the moments the practice is designed for. The canonical instruction for metta appears in the Anguttara Nikaya in its simplest and most demanding form. N 4.125. He abides pervading 1/4 with a mind imbued with loving kindness. Likewise the 2nd, likewise the 3rd, likewise the 4th. So above, below, around, and everywhere, and to all as to himself, he abides pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind imbued with loving kindness, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, without hostility, without ill will, no graduated sequence, no starting with yourself and working outward through concentric circles of warmth. Just pervade all directions, without boundary, without exception. The graduated progression that practitioners learn today, beginning with oneself, then a dear person, then a neutral person, then a difficult person, then all beings, is the contribution of Buddhaghosa, a 5th century commentator whose masterwork, the Visuddhimagga, systematized Buddhist meditation practice in extraordinary detail. It is a valuable pedagogical tool. It is how most teachers teach metta today, and there are good reasons for that. But it is commentarial, not canonical. It is Buddhaghosa's structured path toward the canonical instruction, not the canonical instruction itself. The distinction matters, not to diminish the practice, but to understand what it is and where it comes from. The canonical instruction is, in a way, more radical. Pervade. The metta practice, as the Buddha describes it, is not a warmth you build up from a center and gradually extend outward. It is a quality of mind you train to be unboundaried from the beginning. The aspiration toward all beings' well-being held as the basic orientation of consciousness, not as an achievement reached after sufficient warm-up. In the Itivuttaka, Iti 27, the Buddha makes a claim about metta that is easy to underestimate. Just as the radiance of all the stars does not equal 1/16 of the radiance of the moon, even so, all the grounds for making merit do not equal 1/16th of the awareness release through goodwill. He is saying that the cultivation of genuine goodwill toward all beings is not one spiritual practice among many, not one item on a list of meritorious activities. He is placing it in a category by itself, above generosity, above ritual observance, above many forms of practice that his audience would have considered central to the path. Why? Because metta, properly understood and genuinely cultivated, is not an addition to the practice of non-clinging. It is the practice of non-clinging, operating at the level of relationship. When you hold the intention, may you be well toward another person with no expectation of return, not to be seen as kind, not to produce a reciprocal warmth, not to confirm your own goodness, you have for that moment stepped out of the transaction. You are not using the other person. You are offering something to them. In the Anguttara Nikaya, AN 11.16, the Buddha enumerates 11 concrete benefits of metta practice. 3 of them are worth naming here, because they speak directly to what chronic loneliness produces. A practitioner of metta, the Buddha says, sleeps easily and wakes easily. The agitated, fragmented sleep of hypervigilance begins to settle. They are dear to human beings and dear to non-human beings. The quality of how they are perceived by others shifts, because the quality of what they bring into encounters has shifted, and their mind concentrates quickly. The scattered, threat-scanning attention of the lonely mind finds a ground to rest in. These are not mystical promises. They are descriptions of what changes when the orientation of the mind changes. Thanissaro Bhikkhu has an essay titled "No Strings Attached" that cuts to the heart of what metta actually asks. The lonely person, he observes, enters every encounter carrying a question, even if they would never articulate it this way. What can this give me? Can this person fill the ache? Can this interaction confirm that I am seen, valued, real? The encounter is, beneath its surface, a transaction. The other person is being asked to perform a function. The practitioner of metta enters the same room, sits beside the same people, and carries a different intention. May you be well. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you live with ease. Same room, same people, different inner orientation. This is not a small difference. It is the difference between a relationship experienced as a source and a relationship experienced as a gift. And the people on the receiving end of each orientation know the difference, not necessarily consciously, but in the quality of ease or tension they feel in the presence of each person. The lonely person's armor. What Brené Brown identified as the self-protection that prevents genuine meeting is, at the level of relational intention, the grasping orientation. The metta practitioner has begun, through long training, to set it down, not because they no longer need connection, but because they have cultivated a way of being with others that does not require the connection to deliver anything in particular. What does the science say? Christopher Hutchison and his colleagues at Stanford published a study in 2008 testing whether a brief loving-kindness meditation, just a few minutes, produced measurable changes in how participants felt towards strangers they had never met. It did. Participants who had practiced even a brief session of metta reported increased feelings of connection and positivity toward unfamiliar people compared to a control group. The effect was modest, but it was real, and it appeared after only a few minutes of practice. Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues ran a 7-week randomized controlled trial with 139 working adults. One group practiced loving-kindness meditation daily. The other did not. At the end of 7 weeks, the metta group showed significant increases in positive emotions, social support, and mindfulness. their life satisfaction increased. Their reported illness symptoms decreased. A 2015 meta-analysis by Zhang and colleagues reviewed the accumulated research and found small to moderate effects across studies, consistent but modest. Metta practice reliably shifts the practitioner's relationship to positive emotion and social connection. It does not produce dramatic transformation overnight. It is not a quick fix. This matters to say plainly. Loving kindness meditation will not flood you with warmth on the first session. It may not on the 10th. There will be sessions where the phrases feel mechanical, where the intention feels thin, where you are going through motions you cannot yet feel. That is the beginning of the practice, not its failure. What shifts gradually is not the volume of warmth. It is the structure of the orientation. The mind that has practiced metta consistently, over months, over years, begins to carry a different default question into its encounters. Not what can this give me, but may you be well. The shift is subtle at first. Over time, it changes everything. Robert Waldinger has spent 87 years of research data on what makes for a good human life. He has read every finding, tracked every cohort, followed every correlation. He knows better than almost anyone alive what the numbers say about the importance of relationship quality to health, longevity, and happiness. He's also an ordained Zen priest. He has sat in practice. He has trained the mind. He has experienced from the inside what the data describes from the outside. And after a career that has been simultaneously one of the longest scientific investigations of human flourishing and a decades-long contemplative practice, he keeps both. Not because the data requires the practice, not because the practice requires the data, because he has learned from both directions at once that they are pointing at the same thing. The data says, the quality of your relationships is the single strongest predictor of how well and how long you will live. The practice says, the quality of your relationships depends on the quality of what you bring into them. And that can be trained. Day one of a longer path, but a path that is real, that is walked, and that leads somewhere. Close. We began with a question. Let's return to it. When was the last time you felt truly seen? If you have been thinking about that question while everything else in this video unfolded, the data, the cycle, the Buddhist map, the practice, then you already know that the question is harder than it looks. Because what it is really asking is not just about the people around you. It is asking something about what you bring into the room when you are with them. The lonely person's answer to that question tends to land on other people. The right ones are not there. The ones who are there do not understand. The connections available are insufficient or superficial or simply too few. The problem, as the lonely person experiences it, is outside, in the landscape of available relationships, in the circumstances that have reduced or impoverished their social world. Everything we have looked at tonight points in a different direction, not because the external circumstances do not matter. They do. Retirement genuinely shrinks social networks. Grief genuinely isolates. The structural conditions that produce loneliness in men over 55 are real, and dismissing them would be dishonest. The Surgeon General did not declare a public health crisis because the problem is imaginary, but Cacioppo showed that the cycle is cognitive before it is social, that the lonely person's hypervigilance, their unconscious scanning for rejection, their negative interpretation of ambiguous signals is itself one of the primary mechanisms that perpetuates the condition. And the Buddha, mapping the same territory from the inside, pointed to upadana, to the clinging that turns every encounter into a transaction, every relationship into a referendum on the self. The problem is not only outside, it is also in what you carry through the door. The data say connection is the medicine. Waldinger's 87 years of research on human flourishing arrive at this conclusion with a clarity that is difficult to argue with. The quality of your relationships at 50 predicts your health at 80. This is not a finding at the margins. It is the central finding of the longest study of adult life ever conducted. The Buddha says the medicine does not work if you bring clinging into every dose. When the lonely person reaches for connection, when they pick up the phone, when they accept the invitation, when they sit across from another human being and attempt to be present, they often bring into that encounter the full weight of what they needed to deliver. The ache, the hunger, the question that has been running underneath every surface. Am I someone? And the other person who is trying to meet them feels that weight, feels the demand beneath the conversation, and responds as most people do to demand, by subtly contracting. The medicine administered with clinging does not absorb. It cannot. This is not a counsel of despair. It is the most precise description available of where the work actually lies, and therefore where the possibility of genuine change begins. Robert Waldinger, the man who has spent his career measuring what makes for a good life, is also the man who sits in practice, who has trained the mind, who carries into his relationships and his research the orientation that metta cultivates over years. May you be well. No strings, no transaction, no referendum on the self. He has arrived from two very different directions, empirical science and contemplative practice, at the same place. Relationships are the medicine, and learning how to take the medicine without poisoning it with need is the work of a lifetime. Both are true. Neither is sufficient without the other. He keeps the data and he keeps the practice, not because they prove each other, because they illuminate the same thing from different angles, and together they show it more completely than either can alone. Here is what the Buddha called kalyana mittata, beautiful friendship, admirable companionship, not half the holy life, the whole of it. He was not describing a rare or extraordinary condition. He was describing what becomes available in ordinary relationships, the ones you already have, the ones that are already around you, the ones you may have been measuring against an idea of what connection should feel like and finding insufficient, when the person you bring into them has done enough interior work that they are no longer requiring those relationships to perform a function. What if the relationships you already have, the neighbor, the acquaintance at the coffee shop, the adult child who calls on Sunday, the friend from the years when the activity that held you together still existed? What if those relationships were not the consolation prize, not the inadequate substitute for the connection you are still waiting for? What if they were the path, not because they are perfect, not because they deliver what chronic loneliness is aching for, but because they are where the practice of kalyana mittata actually happens, not in ideal conditions, not with ideal people, but in the ordinary friction and warmth and difficulty of showing up again and again as someone who is learning to offer rather than demand. The most connected generation, and among the loneliest, the way through is not more connection. It is a different quality of presence, and that, unlike the technological infrastructure of connection, unlike the demographic circumstances of retirement and loss, unlike the algorithm that has decided what you see and who sees you, that is something you can train. It begins, as all training does, with the first session,